Good evening, comrades. Welcome to our Lives as We Left series. Tonight we've got Roger Silverman, who's introducing Sidney Silverman. No coincidence, it's his father. Far too little is known about Sidney, I think, who was a very left-wing Labour MP and a co-founder of the campaign for nuclear disarmament. And he was very outspoken on a number of things, which is why he was not promoted as much as some people thought he deserved to be promoted. So we're very happy to have Roger with us to introduce him to us. We're going to the usual format, 30 to 40 minutes introduction, and then comrades can ask questions or make contributions. Thank you, Roger.
All right, thank you, Tina. Well, at first I was hesitant about offering to speak about Sidney Silverman's life because it seemed to imply a sort of dynastic proprietorial interest. So let me make it clear, I'm presenting his life as objectively as I can, a life that I believe deserves recognition in its own right. First, a word about his family background. My grandparents all fled pogroms in the Russian Empire. So together with his brother, my paternal grandfather somehow struggled across Europe from a town called Iași, which is now in Romania. It was then Moldavia. Moldavia had been endlessly battled over by the Habsburg and the Ottoman and the Russian empires. But by that time, Iași was in the Russian sector of Moldavia. By the mid-19th century, the city was at least 1/3 Jewish, going to 50% Jewish by the end of the century. It was the home of the first ever Yiddish language newspaper, site of the first ever professional Yiddish theatre performance, and Jewish musicians in Iași played an important role as preservers of Yiddish folklore, as performers and composers. But it was also, of course, the scene of constant bloody pogroms. Meyer Silverman, which was his name, and his brother decided as young men to join the trek of Jews to the chance of a new life in America. They somehow walked, jumped trains, hitched across the length of Europe, crossed the Channel, and they actually made it as far as Liverpool, the port of transit to the New World. By then, they'd run out of money and they had to spin a coin to decide which of them completed the journey across the Atlantic. And my grandfather lost. And hey presto, here I am. My mother's father similarly had reached Liverpool from the Ukraine. One night, he boarded the ferry and mysteriously disappeared. Later, his body was found floating in the Mersey, the presumed victim of a racist anti-Semitic murder. Back to Meyer, my paternal grandfather, he became what was known as a Scotch draper. In other words, a peddler, barely scraping a living, hawking items around the local villages of neighbouring North Wales and Lancashire, and suffering, of course, desperate poverty. Sidney was born in 1895, one of 4 children. And to understand his background, let's look at the fate of his siblings. Alfred had a miserable, lonely life doing humble, downtrodden jobs. Ruby became a reclusive spinster in a Liverpool slum. In 1958, she was invited to visit our family home in London, and she overstayed for 5 years, suffering schizophrenic delusions and continually conducting strident conversations with an imaginary interlocutor, which was quite an alarming and disturbing experience in my teenage years. Now, as for his brother Ernest, he became an anarchist and a rebel, a fiery agitator on the Liverpool docks, an eloquent public speaker. But working as a solicitor's clerk, he made a habit of repeatedly expropriating the funds in his firm's bank accounts, not for his own personal gain, but in order to help out people who were in hardship. So he was a kind of Robin Hood figure who consequently spent half his life in jail, where he died in a prison cell when I was 12. So all in all, the family had quite a colourful background. And to jump ahead a little, in 1933, Sidney was to marry Nancy Rubinstein, a musician. She was a professional cellist who had played in a trio at a Flea Pit cinema in the days of silent movies. And her father, as I'd said, a refugee from pogroms in Odessa in Ukraine, had been killed in a local racist attack. Her mother, who came from Riga in Latvia, had made ends meet by opening a brick and brack shop and later becoming a self-taught expert in antiques. And I suppose I have to tell you that they had 3 sons: Paul, who you may have seen attending Win meetings; Julian, who was a brilliant Marxist and a colourful political campaigner who tragically died 5 years ago. And then there was me. I came along, something of a belated afterthought. Right, back to my father's biography. He was the only one of his generation who succeeded then in climbing out of this background of failure, madness, and crime. And he won, by sheer strength of intellect, scholarships, first at the age of 13 in 1908 to the private school, the Liverpool Institute, and then aged 18 in 1913 to Liverpool University, where he studied English literature. But the First World War soon caught up with him. And already, of course, a committed socialist, he was denied recognition as a conscientious objector, which would have been an easier option he could have taken on religious grounds. Political grounds for objection were not recognized. So on the contrary, those claiming them were especially brutally victimized. Conscientious objectors were exempted from military service. Sidney was not. So as a socialist, he was just opposed to the war, not on account of any religious scruples, something which was just about tolerated, but for political reasons, which was certainly not. So he was conscripted in 1916. He defied all military orders from the beginning, was arrested, jailed on a sentence of 2 years hard labor. He continued to manifest complete defiance by going on a prolonged partial hunger strike, refusing all solid food and surviving for a year on just a pint of milk a day. And he was constantly agitating in defense of victimized fellow prisoners. After about a year, his sentence was commuted, but on his release, he found a military escort lying in wait for him at the prison gate to conscript him all over again. And once again, he refused all orders, was court-martialed, was jailed again until the end of the war. And in total, he spent 2 years and 3 months in jail. Now, while in jail, he had witnessed and probably himself suffered brutal treatment, thus motivating him to qualify later in law and practice as Britain's first so-called pro bono or poor man's lawyer. His treatment and those of his fellow socialists was far, far worse than that of any conscientious objectors. And it's a heroic story which shaped his whole life. So in 1920, he was readmitted to Liverpool University to complete his BA course. He gained a first-class honours degree in 1921, but unable to find work due to his war record, he accepted a job at Helsinki University in Finland as a lecturer in English literature. But outraged at the harrowing memories of brutality inflicted on prisoners in Walton Jail, and having relished his campaigns there on behalf of fellow prisoners, he returned once again to Liverpool University to take a new degree, this time to study law. And he gained another first-class degree in 1927 after just 2 years of a 3-year course. So in 1928, he opened a solicitor's office without any capital or any professional connections. But his practice soon became known for defense of poor and working class clients, victims of dismissal, termination, or eviction. And usually he was unpaid by his clients and therefore had to live on costs awarded when he won his cases. Of course, that meant that he had to make sure he won, a situation that certainly sharpened still further his forensic skills. It became known that Liverpool's local police chiefs absolutely hated him and called him our greatest enemy. I want to mention one interesting case of his, which by coincidence was mentioned in yesterday's Facebook. When he had the pleasure of cross-examining Sir Oswald Mosley, he was defending the guy who'd been arrested for throwing bricks at Mosley at an open-air fascist rally in Liverpool. He successfully got his client acquitted on the grounds that Mosley couldn't prove which of the many bricks thrown at him had hit him. Yeah, that was something that he always relished the memory of. Now, what about his political life? In 1932, he was elected a Labour councillor and, as he put it, workers' class representative in St Anne's Ward, Liverpool. Soon afterwards, he fought a parliamentary by-election for Labour in Liverpool, but he narrowly lost after a vicious Tory campaign, which was full of anti-Semitic bigotry. But soon afterwards, a delegation arrived from Nelson and Colne Labour Party, which was a nearby militant left Labour constituency party, who visited Liverpool in search of a suitable fighting socialist candidate. And they'd already heard Silverman's name, so they requested a meeting with him. They were at first very upset when he failed to turn up for the interview. But when they discovered the reason for that, things changed. He had opted instead to use the time to help the family of an unemployed docker who was resisting eviction. And they decided on the spot that that's our man. So he fought the 1935 general election as their candidate in the textile towns of Nelson and Colne. For the rest of his life, he represented that constituency over the following 33 years until his death, winning altogether 8 successive elections. Now, the dark 1930s were the scene of his entry onto the national political stage. And during the period 1935 to 39, he fought bitterly and ferociously against the national government, against appeasement of Hitler, and against the Hitler-Stalin Pact. One issue which is of particular interest to us is that, unlike many fellow left MPs, he emphatically condemns the Moscow trials, and he actually went on a national campaign tour around Britain in a circuit of public debates in which he bitterly opposed the Stalinist D.N. Pritt, specifically in order to defend Trotsky against Stalinist lies. Right, the next chapter concerns his role during the Second World War. He opposed all restrictions on the democratic rights of workers, and in one case, in 1944, he successfully defended in the courts and in Parliament the liberties of trade unionists who'd been prosecuted for violating wartime anti-strike laws. But his most important role during these nightmare years was in appealing in vain for the protection of millions of Jews facing extermination in Europe. In 1940, he was elected chair of the British section of an organization called the World Jewish Congress, London being the body's wartime European headquarters. In this capacity, in 1942, he received early warnings of the Nazis' plan for a final solution of the Jewish question, namely, of course, genocidal extermination. And he received this news in the form of a telegram from Geneva containing secret information. He was among the first, therefore, to warn the world and to mount a worldwide campaign to save the European Jewish population from extinction. Of course, a campaign which was ignored and cold-shouldered by the Churchill government, including, of course, its Labour component. So, having received early warnings of the impending Holocaust, he fought desperately for the right of refuge and asylum for Europe's Jews. But he was blocked by the policies of the government, which included Labour's right wing. The Home Secretary in the wartime coalition was Herbert Morrison, Peter Mandelson's grandfather, who blocked entry to Britain by Jews fleeing the Holocaust. According to the book Whitehall and the Jews, 1933 to 1948, British immigration policy throughout that period including under the post-war Attlee government, quote, was designed to keep out large numbers of European Jews, perhaps 10 times as many as it let in. And I want to quote from something he wrote at the time. It is certain that by a deliberate plan, the war on all Jews by Hitler, and practiced as a chronic psychopathic malady since he came to power 9 years ago, has become a raging, tearing frenzy, acute in every part of Europe, where no one before was conscious of any so-called Jewish problem. They have been arrested, scattered, deported across Europe to strange and devastated areas, and there murdered. Men, women, and children, without mercy, without discrimination of age or sex or strength, except some solitary few judged able for some months yet to work on as hopeless slaves. Certain it is that unless help comes, there will soon be no Jews alive in Nazi-occupied Europe. I'd like to add that even in these circumstances, I won't give the quote because it takes too long, but it's to his credit that he added a warning against any scapegoating of the German people and a reaffirmation of socialist internationalist principles. But I want to now deal with the touchy question of his attitude to the Palestine question, because then came the post-war Labour government. The Foreign Secretary in the post-war Labour government, Ernest Bevin, ordered the sinking of the ships carrying concentration camp survivors who were fleeing the misery of displaced persons internment camps to seek a homeland in Palestine. And let's get this clear. Their motive was not to establish a Zionist state or to dispossess the Palestinians, but simply to find somewhere to live. So when Labour's right wing claimed to be friends of the Jews, let them be reminded of their anti-Semitic and literally murderous record of drowning them in the Mediterranean, just as migrants in the opposite direction are being drowned there today. Now, I have a small personal connection with this period in his life, and literally, as you see, very small, because I'm going to quote again from something that my dad wrote. On April the 15th, 1945, my youngest son, that's me, was born. Of course, that's a giveaway, but I can't help that. Resuming the quote, that was the day Bergen-Belsen was liberated by the advancing British armies. But 10 days earlier, Eisenhower had freed Buchenwald. He was so horrified by what he saw, so terrified that nobody would believe it, that he invited the Speaker of the House of Commons to send an all-party delegation of MPs to come, to see, and to testify. And I, he said, was one of them, the only Jew, and even so I had to fight for my place. So I went, leaving my wife and three-day-old son in hospital. Two of the party had had in pre-war days pro-Hitler sympathies. One of them never recovered from the effects of his visit and died shortly after his return. The other committed suicide. Of particular relevance today, in view of the rabid and hypocritical campaign of Labour's right-wing leadership in ostensible defence of Jewish migration to Palestine, in 1946, he had to campaign against the post-war Labour government's military attacks, as I mentioned, on Jewish migrants to Palestine, who were largely concentration camp refugees. It was, as I say, Bevin and the right who sank ships carrying destitute Holocaust survivors to Palestine, fleeing detention camps in search of somewhere to live. Let's remember, these migrants were not colonists or Zionists plotting to rob the local population of their homelands. They were homeless paupers desperate for somewhere to live. Now, I want to quote from a letter that he had received from one of these people, which he read out in a speech to the House of Commons at the time. There are thousands more like me, and my story is the story of my entire generation as Jews. I am 28. I have never eaten bread I have earned with my own hands. This shirt I wear was given me by the Red Cross. This coat I wear came from the partisans. This sweater from my sisters in Palestine. My uncle in the United States sent me a $1 bill, and I bought these boots I wear. During the war, I was in the ghetto. Later on, I joined the partisans, and there I was called the Jew. As the war was over, I returned to my town. Of 7,000 Jews, 2 small children remained. Pulling out a battered photograph from his pocket, he went on, "This is all that remains of my family. One went to the war, was taken prisoner and killed by the Germans. All the rest were slaughtered by the Poles. I don't even know their graves. Here is a photograph of my mother and father. Both were killed by the SS. This is a photo of my school class. All who went to Palestine, 6 of them, survived. All who remained in Poland, 33, are dead. My sisters in Palestine write, 'We want to see you.' This is my story, and it's the story of thousands more." So Sidney Silverman defied the Foreign Secretary Bevin in protest at the brutal policy, and following the establishment of Israel, he also fiercely condemned the actions of the Israeli government in colluding in the Suez War and later in its occupation of Gaza and the West Bank following the 1967 war. So I want to touch on this question of Zionism. Before the age of the Holocaust, neither the Zionist movement nor its smaller offshoot, Poale Zion, had any mass base in the ghettos. They were little more than exotic fringe sects within the Jewish communities of Europe, whose rich political and cultural life was embodied in the Socialist Bund, and whose defiant response both to the anti-Semites and to the Zionists was, "This is our home, we're not going anywhere." Silverman emphatically opposed the status of Israel as an exclusively Jewish racial state, which would arrogate to itself the right to refuse return to its exiles, terrorize its indigenous Arab population, occupy its territorial military conquests, mow down peaceful protesters in their hundreds, jail and torture children, and now to threaten flagrant annexation. And I must say it is breathtaking that those who share his and my outrage at the monstrous policies of the Israeli government can now be indiscriminately branded anti-Semites and hounded out of the Labour Party. Let's remember again, it was the Tories who blocked the entry of refugees from Tsarist pogroms and Nazi extermination and promoted shameless anti-Semitic smears. And their current mouthpieces, the Sun and the Mail, which indulged in flagrant Jew baiting as recently as during the leadership of Ed Miliband. It was Labour's right-wing Foreign Secretary, Ernest Bevin, as I said, who drowned former concentration camp survivors in the Mediterranean. Now, it's true, Sidney Silverman retains to the end of his life misplaced illusions in the goal of a national homeland for Jews. In dispute with Stalinist critics, he argued that the reactionary policies of the Israeli government, which he understood and condemned just as anyone else, but he said this did not justify, as he put it, pretending that Jewish people's national consciousness, pride in their language, care of their culture or faith in their future are more bourgeois, reactionary or capitalist than these things are when practiced by Georgians, Uzbeks, Armenians, or the Russians themselves. However, he utterly condemns the reactionary alliance of the new Israeli state with Western imperialism. At the time of the Suez crisis, he was personally instrumental in forcing the Labour leadership to condemn the joint military action against Egypt by the British government in collusion with France and Israel. And when the Middle East came to war in 1967, which was very shortly before his death, he strongly opposed the Israeli occupation of neighbouring territories. It's beyond doubt that if he had lived beyond February 1968, he would certainly have denounced the continuing occupation and successive wars of colonial repression against the Palestinian people and would have completely dissociated himself from the state of Israel. It was the rise of Nazism which had strengthened Sidney Silverman's defiant reassertion of his Jewish identity and the reality of the Holocaust, which confirmed his own illusions in Zionism. After the war, what had previously throughout Eastern Europe been a peripheral reactionary sect became a credible, if ultimately illusory lifeline. Jewish survivors of the concentration camps, as I say, were desperately seeking refuge somewhere where they could begin to build a new life free from persecution and the threat of annihilation. And to that generation, the reactionary nature of Zionism, with its susceptibility to future exploitation by world imperialism to create an outpost from which to suppress the Arab national uprising, had not yet become apparent to all. The rickety boats of those Holocaust survivors were turned back or sunk by British colonial warships, deliberately drowning refugees. Their settlements were besieged by feudal kingdoms and sheikdoms and the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem. And in their desperation, they were all too easily seduced by Zionist demagogy. It might have been possible at that time to confront communal rivalry. In Palestine in the 1920s, there had been 500,000 Arabs and 150,000 Jews, many of whom worked and struggled side by side. For instance, the heroic revolutionary Leopold Schepper, who was later to organize within Nazi Germany the underground communist spy network, the Red Orchestra, had organized in Palestine at that time the Ichud Itachak unity movement, which brought Jewish and Arab workers under a single banner, organized joint strikes, and challenged the power of the Zionist Histadrut, which only admitted Jewish workers. Right, back to the other issues in his life in the next period of his life. During the 1950s and 1960s, Sidney Silverman was a continual thorn in the side of the Labour leadership. In 1951, he opposed the Labour government's pro-American, pro-NATO rearmament programme. For the first time, he had the parliamentary whip withdrawn by Attlee. In 1959, he became a co-founder of the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament. Then in 1960, as chair of the new left grouping, Victory for Socialism, he attacked Gaitskell's leadership of the Labour Party. And I would like to quote what he wrote at the time, or what he said, I think, in a speech. The leader of the party has made himself the spokesman not of the whole party, but of a small unrepresentative clique. Under Mr. Gaitskell's personal inspiration, it has induced the party to muffle its attack on capitalism, play down the radical aims of the party, and choose bipartisanship with the Tories on vital issues. Mr. Gaitskell has been responsible for plunging the party into futile controversy about Clause 4. We believe that his leadership is a source of weakness, confusion, and disunity in the party, and that in the interests of the party, he ought to resign. Now, comrades, just compare that. This is impinging on other debates that I and many of us have been involved in the recent period. But is it not clear from that quote alone the difference between the Labour Party at the time of Gaitskell and the Labour Party at the time of Tony Blair? Could anybody have been found attacking Blair for inducing the party to muffle its attack on capitalism, when the new Labour government was, of course, the chosen instrument of capitalism, the beneficiary of limitless funds, the beneficiary of propaganda in support of its election by Rupert Murdoch and the Sun and so on. And who actually, which of the left leaders, which of the campaign group or any of the so-called lefts today ever called for the resignation of Blair or are calling today for the resignation of Starmer? I think there is no question that if Sidney Silverman was alive today, he would not have been complicit in colluding it with or in keeping quiet about the betrayal of what was the original socialist principles, which in the founding of the Labour Party and in particularly the adoption of Clause 4. So actually soon followed his next expulsion from the Parliamentary Labour Party. People hold up their hands in horror about the withdrawal of the whip from Jeremy Corbyn. Sidney Silverman had the whip withdrawn by Attlee. He had the whip withdrawn again by Gaitskell, and he was about to have the whip withdrawn again by Wilson when he died just in time to prevent that outcome. In 1961, following the Labour Party conference vote in favour of nuclear disarmament, along with 4 other MPs, including, by the way, the brief future leader Michael Foot, Sidney Silverman voted in Parliament against the government defence estimates. And this, of course, was in line with official party policy as decided by party conference. Nevertheless, they were all expelled from the Parliamentary Labour Party. So the whip had been withdrawn again under Gaitskell. Incidentally, one of the rather good legal arguments that he made at the time is, look, I'm in favour of freedom of conscience. I'm completely in favour of any MP who disagrees with official party policy to express their opposition to it, to express their differences. But surely you shouldn't be penalised for agreeing with party policy as decided by party conference. Now, the thing that he's most probably known for today is his role, well, I don't know if it's known today actually, but it was in his time, his role in the campaign against the barbarity of capital punishment. In 1948, based on his nightmare memories of incarceration in prisons where war resistors were brutally beaten up, and by the way, in at least one case, fatally, he had fellow prisoners, fellow war resistors, at least in one case, who were beaten to death. And of course, in a prison where other inmates periodically were hanged, Silverman was absolutely horrified, and he launched the first of many private members' bills in Parliament to abolish the death penalty or capital punishment. This was a lifelong struggle. 3 times he brought private members' bills, all of them always bitterly opposed, not only by the Tories, but by Labour Home Secretaries alike, always defeated at the last stage. Victory was to come only decades after he'd begun his campaign in 1965, when the Wilson government, still not daring to initiate the reform itself, did at least allow him time to bring, for the 3rd time, a private member's bill. So finally, after a lifelong struggle, he did successfully carry a bill through Parliament to abolish capital punishment. The Wilson government had allowed his private bill to go through. And you'll be surprised, but I would like to make a quote from a book that I recently discovered to my surprise. It was the memoirs, or a book by the former Prime Minister, James Callaghan. And he wrote in relation to this campaign, the undoubted hero of the campaign was Sidney Silverman MP. Small in stature, by the way, something was always commented on. He was only actually 5'2" tall. Small in stature, up-tilted head, erect carriage, a quick pattering footstep, and a prominent pointed beard, which was almost a weapon in itself. In the Commons, he always perched himself on the corner seat just below the gangway, adjoining the government front bench, his feet hardly touching the ground. From that advantageous position, he was always ready to jump to his feet at any moment. He was fearless in the face of hostility, of which there was plenty, and coupled this with great skill as a parliamentarian and with considerable legal knowledge and practical experience brought from his profession as a solicitor. He carried a formidable armoury that convinced many of us just back from the war in the late 1940s that hanging should go. And Callaghan goes on to say, I cannot say that until then hanging had impinged on my thinking. It was only when I reached Parliament in 1945 and was confronted by the need to take a position that I concluded that hanging should be abolished. Now, in a recent television programme on the abolition of capital punishment, a most disgusting assertion was repeatedly made. It was said again and again that this victory was a defeat for public opinion by what was called a liberal establishment elite. This is an absolutely monstrous and absurd travesty. The labour movement and trade unions had a long and honourable tradition of resistance to repression and capital punishment. Silverman himself had staged a hunger strike in prison against brutal treatment as an opponent to the First World War. His 25-year parliamentary campaign against capital punishment had met with bitter and unanimous opposition from successive governments, the Home Office, the police, the judges, the press barons, that is, from every single part of the establishment. So I wrote this to the producer, and I said, contrary to your distorted presentation of the issue, his ultimate victory in bringing to an end the barbarity of capital punishment in Britain through a private member's bill without government backing represented a stunning historic defeat for the establishment. And then I said, a salient point, you mentioned the surge of popular support for the death penalty in the wake of the Moors murders, but you omitted the highly significant fact that when a relative of one of the child victims of these murders stood as an independent pro-hanging candidate against Silverman in his constituency in the 1966 election, he actually increased his majority. Of course, these media parasites refused to correct their contemptible misrepresentation of this issue. So, as I say, in 1966, he won his 8th successive election victory with an increased majority, despite the intervention of a pro-hanging candidate in the aftermath of the local Moors murderers. Of course, everybody's familiar with the case, the monstrous murders of children. Now, this is the last point, because in 1967, a year before his death, Sidney Silverman once again courted expulsion from the parliamentary party by writing an open letter condemning Harold Wilson's attack on the right of Labour MPs to criticise the Labour government. He called him in so many words a traitor. He accused him of betraying socialist principles. When the chief whip tried to pacify him with compliments, patronising compliments, describing his campaign against capital punishment as his great memorial, he gave what I think is the best possible put down in the circumstances. He said, the only memorial I would value is that I've given a lifetime of service in the Labour Party's continuing effort to establish a socialist society under a Labour government in this country. He was not prepared to be patronised as somebody who carried through a liberal reform. He reasserted his commitment to socialism. It was a fitting epitaph, and he died only months later in 1968. So we have to say that goal was no nearer realisation. Now, how would we sum up his life? He'd never joined any left lobby group. He was never what was called at the time a Bevanite. He was suspicious of all the so-called fair weather friends of the left at the time. He had monumental integrity. He ploughed a lonely furrow. He adhered in general to Marxist economic theory, but he never joined any group. He was a revolutionary to his core and in every cell of his body. In his political outlook, well, like many of his generation, he hoped that future Labour governments could continue the programme of successive nationalisations ostensibly initiated by the 1945 government. But he bitterly resisted any hint of backtracking or compromising. So to those who would glibly dismiss him as a reformist, I would say, you achieve 1/100th of what he did, and then maybe I'll listen to you. An exemplary life. Thanks, comrades.
Wow. That was fantastic, fascinating, really, really interesting. And while you were talking, I've had a look for a little video, and I'm going to share that quickly now. There's a video of him as he's on the death penalty. Okay, it's just a few minutes, I think, where he's talking. They're interviewing him.
Life imprisonment. Undeterred by this crime wave, the abolitionists continue their fight. Their spokesman, lawyer MP Sidney Silverman, says,
just because death is irrevocable and human judgment never infallible, The state must not itself take life unless it cannot protect itself otherwise. No decent man or woman would tolerate hanging for a moment if hanging were unnecessary. Is it necessary?
The question is, does justice in 1948 still mean an eye for an eye, a life for a life?
Trying to switch it off. Hello. So the only thing the thing I really disagree with you is on the, the assessment of the Labour Party. I mean, clearly your father, Sidney Silverman, used Parliament as a platform. He used his position not to be cowed by the Labour leaders, but he used it to, run a number of really important campaigns and speak out. I mean, if only we had an MP like that at the moment, do we? It's not the left, the so-called left in Parliament are doing, as you said, maybe not even a tenth of that. So you can do something even when you're not in government, etc. When you're in opposition, when you're an oppositionist. So that was really impressive. I was going to ask you actually about the lobby group, but then you answered it right at the end. So he never joined up with any other lefties. He was never part of an organized group to try and put pressure on the leadership, or never?
No, he was absolutely a loner. And I think that's partly a personality trait and partly a side of his political insight.
All right, that he didn't trust the others, was it?
No.
Fair enough. But he did work with the CND then, I understand. And
Oh, yes. No, of course he collaborated. He was in CND, he was in Victory for Socialism, and, of course, many others.
Yeah.
But he, politically, he stood absolutely firmly on his own convictions and was just not interested in modifying them or compromising with anybody.
Do you think, did he consider himself, you said he considered himself a revolutionary, did he consider himself a Marxist at all?
He used to, in fact, he taught me my first elements of Marxism, in my quite early. I mean, I don't think I can't remember any time when I didn't consider myself a socialist. I've got to tell one little story. I remember as a toddler, before I could read, I don't know why I remember this, but I pointed to a word on a text because I just liked the look of the word. And I remember asking him, just pointing to them and saying, what's that word? Guess what it was?
Socialism. Communism. Very good.
So anyway, he explained in a very good popular way by kind of fables. He explained capitalism. He explained, he explained the famous thing, that there were children running around barefoot because their fathers had made too many shoes. That was one of the paradoxes that he talked about. Talk about overproduction. And other things. So he would he considered himself a Marxist in terms of economics, shall we put it that way?
Mm-hmm.
But he never allied himself or joined any of the revolutionary groups, Trotskyist groups, or anything.
And Communist Party wasn't his interest.
Not the Communist Party particularly, because he was very suspicious and careful, cautious about them. But and as I say, he almost stood out on a limb in defending Trotsky at the time of the Moscow trials. So, yes, he had his flaws. I would say, in terms of theory, he was not particularly well developed, but I think he amply compensated for that by his campaigning spirit.
What was his view about the Russian Revolution and, before the Soviet Union turned into its opposite? Was he a supporter?
Absolutely. I mean, he considered it one of the inspirations of his life. Absolutely.
Oh, wow. Okay, very interesting. So Tony has a few questions on that Palestine issue you raised. I did try and find, actually Google that incident, because I've not heard much about that. And I'm sure Tony is a fountain of knowledge on it. Hello, Tony.
Yeah, well, I mean, thank you, Roger. That was a brilliant exposition, and it really did bring your father to life in a way that I've never quite appreciated him before. Because I do remember Sydney, just about, it was when I was young and growing up and becoming politically aware, and he was certainly what I would say was an extremely maverick left-winger inside the Labour Party, without a doubt. I'll give you an anecdote as well, because I spent most of my childhood in Liverpool, and I can remember getting busted once in a squat and being arrested. It was obvious I was Jewish from my name, just like Sydney. And the sergeant who was booking me into the custody said, "I hope you're not the relative of that bastard Silverman." Their objection was, of course, his role in the abolition of capital punishment, which, of course, was very unpopular with the police and the prison service. So, yes, I mean, it was a great tribute, and the campaign that he ran. And one can only wish that any of the campaign group could come anywhere near his stature and his bravery, because, of course, they are really a bunch of cowards when it comes to it. However, I mean, I do have some disagreements, but firstly, just on the question of the Holocaust, what happened, and Sydney does make an appearance in my book, which is coming out, you'll be pleased to know. Gerhard Riegner, who was the Jewish agency representative in Geneva, was given the information from at least two sources about the Holocaust, because there was, if you like, an open question as to whether what the Germans were doing were just massacring in large numbers, or whether there was a deliberate plan to exterminate the whole of the Jewish people in the continent of Europe. And he sent that telegram. It was at the middle of August 1942, and the Holocaust had already been going for over a year, and the extermination camps had been open from late November 1941. He sent it to the British and the American consulates in Geneva, who then telegraphed it to their respective governments. The American government sat on it and just did not disclose it to anyone. The British government, in the form of the Deputy Foreign Secretary, Richard Law, sent it to Sidney Silverman. And Sidney Silverman then sent it to the leader of the American Zionists, Rabbi Stephen Weiss, who was then requested by the American State Department to suppress the news. And that's exactly what Stephen Weiss did. For 3 long months, the most intense period of the Holocaust, they estimate 1.5 million died, and that 1942 was the most intense period of the Holocaust anyway, but that was a particularly intense period. Stephen Weiss sat on the news of the Holocaust at the request of the State Department. And afterwards, he boasted that he and others in the Zionist movement or the Zionist leaders in America had done their utmost to suppress the news of the Holocaust. So I think one has to put that in the context of what was happening in Europe. I also have, and I'm just looking, you mentioned the Mufti. I didn't quite get that, but can I just say about the Palestinian Mufti? The Palestinian Mufti was appointed by the British, in fact, by the British High Commissioner, Sir Herbert Samuel, who was an ardent Zionist, even though he came fourth in the elections because this was a religious post commanding considerable religious funds. And there's no doubt the Zionists preferred the most reactionary Arab leader of the Palestinians to any nationalist or secular leader. So I think we do have to be quite clear about that. The Mufti never had any significant support amongst the Palestinians. He was in essence imposed by the British and the Zionists themselves. You mentioned Herbert Morrison, and again, I deal in my book with him, but Herbert Morrison, there's no doubt about it, was anti-Semitic. He is said to have doubted that the Holocaust was taking place, in fact, but one of the quotes I got was that his opposition to the immigration of Jewish refugees from Europe was because he thought they would be an explosive element after the war. And if you translate that, he means he feared industrial struggles and that communist Jews would be at the forefront of opposition. What he did his excuse for refusing to admit the refugees was fear of anti-Semitism. Given that 80% of the British people in the beginning of 1943, after the news of the Holocaust had been officially announced by the Allies on the 17th of December 42, 80% of the British people supported the immigration of the allowing into Britain any refugee who could make it. But Morrison preferred to allow the minority who opposed that to triumph on the grounds of anti-Semitism. But I think we can understand why Morrison, who was an ardent Zionist, was nonetheless opposed to Jewish immigration. And of course, the Board of Deputies did not raise one whisper about that, because they too were opposed to the immigration of Jewish refugees. And I give you an example, because it was at the end of 42 that Vichy France was overrun. It was around that time anyway. But just before that, there was a chance of getting thousands of Jewish refugees out of Vichy France and into Britain. And Morrison personally vetoed that. So he had the death of thousands of Jews who were then deported to Auschwitz and the Bittel detention camp and other detention camps in Vichy France, because Vichy France did not have Nazi soldiers in, and it was relatively safe in comparison with the Nazi-occupied territories. I'm not saying it was absolutely safe, because it wasn't. Just other things about the British attacks on the Jewish refugees. It's actually much, much more complicated than that. There were displaced persons camps in Europe where the refugees were concentrated, and the Zionists were active in those camps in attacking those Jews who wanted to go to America. In fact, the vast majority of them did want to go to the United States, not to Palestine. And it was a combination. The Zionists were organized, Haganah was organized in those camps, and they dealt quite brutally. They beat up and attacked those Jews, the Bundists, who were their enemies in that. In addition, in America, in the United States, the Zionists were opposing the lowering of any immigration barriers. So there is absolutely no doubt that the Zionists were using the Holocaust survivors as a battering ram to lower the immigration barriers in Palestine. I'm not necessarily justifying what the British did, but I have to put it into perspective. And incidentally, the refugee ship Patria, which docked in Haifa Harbor, I think it was 1943, the British were going to basically deport the people in it to Mauritius, which was a British colony. The Zionists preferred to sink the boat. They planted a bomb on it, and I think half of the passengers died as a result in Haifa Harbor, because the Zionists, the Haganah, preferred to make a point in terms that Jews would only go to Palestine. So I add those, if you like, points, but I appreciated very much your talk, and thank you very much.
Thanks, Tony. Has anybody else got any comments or questions? And put your hand up now. Okay, there is Paul. Roger, do you want to reply to anything that Tony just said?
No, I mean, I'm looking forward very much to, you're writing a book, I believe. I'm very much looking forward to reading that and probably filling in a lot of gaps in my knowledge of the situation. I think, my point about that chapter in my father's life is not that I was uncritical of his support for Zionism, but I found it credible and understandable.
Yeah, I agree. In the circumstances, yes, of course. Of course.
Right. Okay.
Thanks, Tony. Paul, please.
Hi, Roger. Thanks for that. I really enjoyed it. In fact, the only bit I did know about was the anti-capital punishment campaign. Beyond that, I didn't really know anything about Roger's Sidney Silverman beyond that campaign. I have to ask, due to the first question that was asked by Tina at the beginning, given his own treatment, it's difficult, I know, because he's not here to answer, of course, but given his own treatment in the Labour Party specifically, and what's going on today, obviously my question will be, if he was around today, where do you think he would stand in relation to the Labour Party? Thanks.
Leading
Right.
question. He'd be in the
Well,
Socialist Labour Network.
of course, of course. No, I mean, well, I mean, you've given me the opportunity to actually place him exactly where I want to in the spectrum. I can't say for sure, but I mean, I would say that I cannot possibly conceive, when you look at the way that he savaged Attlee and savaged Gateskill and savaged Wilson, the idea that he would somehow, you know, keep silent in the age of Starmer, as the Socialist Campaign Group have done, is completely inconceivable to me. I am absolutely certain that he would have, well, I put it this way, he would have supported my position on this, which is, of course, that the Labour Party now is in exactly the same position as the Liberal Party was in 1900. That in other words, that it's a workers' party at its base. That, of course, that's a difference. The workers' party at its base, but it's had a capitalist party grafted on and is suppressing it and suffocating it and purging it of any socialist elements. And that being the case, as with the Labour Party which moved from, as with the Labour movement, the trade unions that cut their ties with the Liberal Party and formed the Labour Party in 1900, that is exactly what needs to be done now. We have a situation now where Starmer does not allow his MPs to stand on picket lines. The Labour Party was formed precisely in order to defend the legal right to strike and to solidarize with trade union actions. So in that situation, I think he would have had exactly the same position as we who've been arguing that we need a break of the trade unions and the socialist element of the party, a complete break and the formation of a new mass workers' party, not a one-man pop-up party, but a mass party based on the workers' organizations.
Though he was a member of the Labour Party in some troubling times, and he didn't leave. But we don't know.
Yes,
okay.
but that was. I mean, this is starting on a completely new discussion. But I mean, the point is, as we saw under Attlee, under Gateskill, under Wilson, up until the time of Blair, it was it remained a workers' party, of course, infused and infested with cowards and traitors, in the words of the Red Flag. But a completely new situation emerged in 1994 with the takeover of the Labour Party by New Labour, which declared itself a new party, which scrapped Clause 4 as a symbolic gesture to the ruling class to say we're not even going to pretend anymore to stand for a change in society. And the most eloquent evidence of all is the attitude of big business. For the first time ever, for a period of about a decade, the British capitalist class considered New Labour its instrument, its political instrument. They starved the Tory party of funds, and they used all their powers. They used Rupert Murdoch and the powers of propaganda and all the rest of it to ensure that New Labour stayed in power in order to carry through Thatcher's programme at a time when Thatcher herself was too discredited to be able to do it under her own flag, or major under the flag of the Tories. So anyway.
And yet we had Corbyn after that, but let's not have a two-way.
A last spasm.
Yeah,
due to a blunder by the right wing. No other reason.
We're actually going to discuss all of that next week in an extra session, I should have said, and I should stop going on about it as well, because I know I'm goading you as well. John, hi.
Good evening, Tina, and good evening, Roger, and all. Thank you for your excellent recount of your father's life, and very informative it was, and appreciate that. Just one observation: you talked about the time when he was in jail and got beaten by the screws. From my own memory, my own father and his father had been conscientious objectors. My grandfather, who was born only a year different to your father, in 1896 or 94, after that. Anyway, it was only a year different, so they would have been of a similar age. And my grandfather was a CO in World War One, and my father was CO in World War Two. And in both cases, they recalled times when I was young of being beaten in jail by the screws. And what they both noted at the time was that common criminals were treated relatively fairly by the screws, but as conscientious objectors and any political prisoners were picked on, singled out for violence from the authorities. In fact, my own father took a protest in refusing to pay national insurance in 1965 on the grounds that he knew that the funds raised from would be later used for war. He was a pacifist. Of course, he was beaten in the army jail in Leeds. One of my earliest memories was visiting him there, and he was beaten so badly. His mother managed to report it to the press, and the Daily Mail of all people published a story about it in their front page. Just that observation that obviously political prisoners are always the first to receive violence from the schools. So thanks, Roger, for an excellent just an observation.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. So I think that's part of the history which needs to be brought to light.
Absolutely. There was a good series, actually. I can't remember what it called in the BBC, about young men who don't want to go to war and what happened to them in Britain. And obviously in Germany, there's another story there. Death usually followed there. Comrades, anybody else who wants to ask a question or make a comment, raise your hand now. Otherwise, we are bringing this to a close. Thank you very much, Roger. That was a fascinating, insightful episode. I'm glad we can convince you to do your own father, although it's probably a bit strange, but it much better because you actually know him so very well. So that was very interesting. As I said, next week we're going to have a discussion amongst a few comrades, and everybody else, of course, is allowed to participate and welcome to participate on where we are and where we're going. It's a question that's going to last a while longer, I think. So it's the nature of the crisis in Britain, the war in Ukraine, China, and how we're getting out of it, what we can do now as the left. So I hope you join us next Thursday. So Roger will be speaking there. Kevin Bean and who else? Graham Bash is speaking as well, and I think Steve Freeman. So it should be an interesting discussion, and everybody's of course invited to participate. So
I'll just say thank you to the audience. Thank you to all of you for your very pleasant comments. Thank you very much. And I'm glad now that I did do this. Not from my own behalf, but I think that's a life that ought to be better known.
Absolutely. You should also start editing the Wikipedia entry on your dad, because it's very short.
Yeah.
It's an interesting life for sure. Thank you, comrades. See you all next week, hopefully. Good evening.